plagued by frequent ethnic and religious uprisings. What happened to 3,000 Christian martyrs? Architectural marvel of the first century, 160 feet tall, 620 feet long by 513 feet wide, 100,000 cubic meters of stone and concrete, housing up to 50,000 bloodthirsty spectators.
Was it the glory of Rome, or a brutal slaughterhouse to 3,000 Christian martyrs? To answer that question, we need to go back to the beginning.
It was 30 AD, and Judea, or Palestine as the Romans would call it, was a distant backwater in the Roman Empire, plagued by frequent ethnic and religious uprisings.
Shortly before his crucifixion on a Roman cross, a young rabbi would make the following statement.
But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is at hand. Luke 21:20.
40 years later, this statement would come true in dramatic fashion.
Titus Vespasianus descended upon Jerusalem with 4 Roman legions, 24,000 soldiers, obliterating the sacred temple and most of the Jewish population.
What was left of Jerusalem was carted back to Rome in triumphal procession,
memorialized to this day on the Arch of Titus. To commemorate his son's victory, Emperor Vespasian began construction of a stadium that would dwarf all others that had come before it. The structure was completed by his son in 80 AD, and a 4th story added 2 years later by Emperor Domitian. But none of these Flavian emperors would lift a literal finger.
The magnificent Colosseum was actually built by enslaved Jews from Judea and paid for with the plunder of Jerusalem.
Amphitheaters were nothing new to antiquity. In ancient Greece and Rome, they were used for religious celebrations, civic debates, and elections, as well as, most notably, fine theatrical presentations, many of which have survived in written form to the present day.
But the colossal Flavian amphitheater was much too grandiose for such noble activities.
Instead, gladiators took the stage, squaring off in savage, bloody combat to the death.
And when the novelty of these lethal contests wore off,
lions, tigers, and other exotic animals were imported from distant lands to serve as both combatants and executioners.
Perhaps befitting the Colosseum's bloody conception, blood became its primary purpose.
As political unrest grew, so did the size and violence of these spectacles. At one point, the Colosseum was filled with water to enact a sea battle, drowning untold numbers of hapless participants.
Shockingly, many who died in the Colosseum volunteered to do so.
And I'm not talking about the convicted criminals who chose to fight as gladiators for a chance at freedom. I'm talking about the thousands who were bound hand and foot to be fed to beasts, or hung on crosses, or burned at the stake.
Many of whom could have avoided death simply by bowing the knee before the image of Caesar.
The first recorded Christian martyr in the Colosseum was Saint Ignatius, during the reign of Emperor Trajan. He was the Bishop of Antioch, student of Polycarp and St. John the Apostle, and early church father who wrote at least 7 epistles that still survive today.
In his own writings, he described how he was transported by 8 Roman soldiers all the way to Rome to be fed to beasts. His only crime? Refusing to worship Roman gods.
Many early writers refer to the martyrdom of St. Ignatius, including Eusebius, St. Jerome, and John Chrysostom, who was the first to place his death in the Colosseum.
In the next 2 centuries, 3,000 Christians would follow St. Ignatius to a similar death before tens of thousands of spectators in the Colosseum.
And for what? A dream of heavenly glory? A fantasy in the clouds? What could possibly be so attractive in this new religion that it would be worth such an unattractive death?
In the history of the Church, Eusebius tells us why.
The bishops of the Church that evinced by their blood the genuineness of the religion which they preached. In the presence of the emperor, he proclaimed the heavenly kingdom of Christ, first in an oral defense, and afterwards by deeds as well.
For nearly 300 years, Christians proved the truth of the gospel by dying for it, and this gave them audience with emperors.
And then one day, a Roman emperor named Constantine saw a vision of a shining cross in the sky and heard the words, "In hoc signo vinces," or "by this sign conquer."
After his conversion, Constantine stopped the long-standing state-sponsored persecution of Christians.
The bloody days of the Colosseum were coming to an end. After the fall of the Western Empire in 476 AD, the Great Walls began to crumble. By the 12th century, it was repurposed as a fortress, and in the 15th, as a rock quarry.
It wasn't until the 1990s that state-funded restoration efforts began anew.
Today, it is one of the most visited sites in Italy, and most iconic buildings in the world. But the infamous Colosseum will forever be remembered for the 3,000 Christian martyrs who died there.
The fear of death could not stop them from sharing the gospel. What is stopping you?
The text today, Acts chapter 1, starting at verse 4. Let me get the smooth reading. My translation. Hope you can see it. And being assembled together, Joshua instructed them, "Don't leave from Jerusalem, but wait around for the promise of the Father, the one you heard from me. Indeed, John immersed in water, but you will be immersed in a set-apart spirit after not many of these days." And of course, you find in your popular Bible something else in this portion that is highlighted. And I put in the Greek there and the direct translation of it just to show you, or anybody, that my translation is correct. Verse 6. So those having assembled together were asking him, saying, "Really, Master? Are you restoring the government to Israel at this time?" But he said to them, "It's not yours to know times or seasons that the Father placed in his own authority. But you'll receive power when the set-apart Spirit has come upon you. And you'll be my witnesses," or martyrs. The word martyres means both. "You'll be my witnesses, martyrs, for me in both Jerusalem and in all the Judea, also Samaria, even to the fullest extent of the land." And that's the text for today. Next week, we'll go on to chapter 2, probably, Father willing. Today's text, of course, is well known. I'm sure that you've heard it before, and chances are you're able to recite it in its entirety. Most people in the Pentecostal church can do that because it's one of the last churches to continue to teach this doctrine concerning what Joshua told his disciples about what they could expect to receive. And where the reading leaves off, I'll wager that you're able to go on with the rest of the chapter from your memory. Now, these passages had a profound effect on me since childhood and throughout young adulthood. and maybe upon you too, because they're powerful. They're powerful. You also know that the original word, as I mentioned, martyres, usually translated witnesses, as in my witness, has two meanings, one just as proper as the other. Martyres also means martyrs, speaking of those that give their lives for the message. We know that in those days, if someone receives that calling and becomes that witness, and if that person loudly and boldly speaks the good news in a public place, that person risks swiftly moving from the category of witness to that of martyr. For at the time, the good news was considered subversive, a foreign superstition, and it carried a sentence of death, and that death often by crucifixion. Until just last week in our country, the land of the free, if someone became a bold witness for life, that one could end up in jail or even prison. Some went to prison, and many have, actually, as you know. In a neighboring country, such a one receives a bullet. That's in Mexico. Hopefully, in our country, a witness for the truth or on behalf of unborn children need not fear the government anymore, at least in the short term. For the rest of the world, nothing has changed since Roman times. It's only gotten worse as the population has increased. Now, the Center of the Study of Global Christianity estimated that in a recent year, 90,000 believers were killed for religious reasons, and hundreds of thousands more live through daily harassment by those who are on the dark road. Knowing that, let's go back where this manner of persecution really began in history, to the close of the Jewish war, which we've studied thoroughly, that is the Colosseum, and the many sports arenas throughout the Roman world. The Colosseum wasn't the only one, but it was the largest one in the universe, and it was and still remains in Rome, as you saw. Every major city in the Roman world had its own sports arena, and that the sport often consisted of the torture and death of men and women of faith. What's little known is that when the Jewish temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, its great wealth was taken away by the Romans, as evidenced in, as we saw, the Titus Arch. All this wealth became the booty of Emperor Vespasian. To satisfy the bloodthirsty populace for this new rule, Vespasian did something great for them. He used that money to build this world wonder, evidenced in, again, the Arch of Titus. And the Colosseum took 10 years to build. The arch is called Titus Arch because Titus, Vespasian's son, was the conqueror and collector of the gold of Jerusalem. A few pictures, if you please. Here's the arch as it stands right now. It's a commemoration of the captivity of Jerusalem and Titus' victory there. And on this arch, as you may know, is a bas relief. This is a reproduction where you see the menorah, golden menorah, a couple of the silver trumpets. I don't know what these other things are. They look almost like standards. But these two represented the wealth of Jerusalem and all of Israel being taken into Rome for the triumph. When a general won, occupied a major city, they would come back to Rome with the booty, with the prisoners, and they would have a parade. They would show the people the booty that they had gained, And at the end of the parade, they would take the prisoners and throw them off a cliff. And this is a close-up then of the menorah. We know just exactly what the gold menorah in the Holy of Holies, if it was in there, looked like, because we have this representation of it from those days. Is there one more? This was the embarrassment of Judea in all the world, this denarius coin, portraying Judea as a slave woman, hands tied together, and the coconut palm, the sign of Israel. This circulated throughout the Roman Empire, and they are still found this day, this one being in fine condition. There were several other coins also that celebrated Judea Capta, the captivity of Judea, as well, and they're still being found. For over 300 years, the Colosseum and the many arenas worldwide provided the people with bloody entertainments, spectacular events that no pious person today could stand to behold. I certainly put myself in that Colosseum, and therefore fighting of the, what are they called? Gladiators, fighting of the gladiators. I know I couldn't stand that. I couldn't stand it. Could you? I didn't think so. Many bold witnesses became those martyrs in this time, for the grinding out of believers was Roman policy, and especially during the reign of Diocletian, a couple hundred years later, 284 to 305, toward the end of the era of gladiators in 401 AD. For in January 1st, AD 404, that marked Rome's last known gladiatorial games. Then the games suddenly stopped all over the world. And how so? Well, that's what another thing we want to discover today. Yahshua's words found in our text today inform us as to what it takes to stop evil immediately and entirely, assuming now that the games were stopped by this method. How else could it be? We haven't the time today to go through Acts 1 through 3 thoroughly. They are just packed with important information. But rest assured that we'll do so the next time we're together. For us today, these chapters may be the most important of them all for destroying evil. Yet, also today, they are heeded by only a few in comparison to how many believers there are in this world. The Acts 1 text implies that if one goes a step beyond being born again, one step, if one's desire is greater, if one's calling is stronger, if one's vision is wider, that one can be endowed with the supernatural power and authority that gave the master the ability and the charisma to work wonders. It doesn't come with a born-again experience. It's the next stop in the journey. It's the next camp on the way up to perfection. Now, Yahshua speaks of a second immersion in that passage beyond water. Some today call it a second work of grace. And the Master speaks of it and demonstrates it in many passages. For instance, in Acts 1, verse 5, Yahshua calls it, in literal terms, immersion in a set apart spirit. Being immersed means being totally covered with, may I say, Holy Spirit, a Holy Spirit that, and in verse 8, he speaks of it as having the set apart spirit come upon you. There's a "the" in there for set apart spirit. Many have had this experience. Those who know of it and have waited in expectation for it, that is, tarried for it, as I did many years ago. So some here may even know what I'm talking about because you've experienced it, the empowerment, especially if you've grown up in a church environment that still teaches it. You can find one. If you have, I'm sure that you'll agree with me in saying that you can never forget that first overshadowing, that first immersion in spirit, and that's greatly affected your life and your service. Again, we'll speak of particulars next time, what it's all about, if it's still for today, if it's for people like us, and if so, how to experience it, how to live in its power and forever. We'll also talk about why the church has abandoned it next time. If a humble believer is willing to speak publicly and boldly against the world's evil, he or she must be endowed with the heavenly spiritual power that's come upon them and is working through them. A person just can't do it on their own. And being saved or being born again is simply not enough. The red letters say, without me, you can do nothing. But this empowerment has some drawbacks, including persecutions and even martyrdoms. Red letters, blessed are those who are persecuted for my name's sake. Acts 1 earlier told us that when the Spirit came upon these apostles during the particular feast of Pentecost, they were all immersed and swimming in it, along with a lot of other people. It's not simply a goosebump during a prayer or two every 10 years. It's something that stays with you, and you are cognizant of it every day, every minute of your life. It's often forgotten that these first apostles were all martyred in the end, with the possible exception of one apostolic witness who had to live long enough to prophesy the history of that time just before it happened, the apostle that circulated the revelation. And the other exception was, secondly, a priestly witness, a person who was an eyewitness to the events of those 7 years prophesied that we call the revelation, the one who wrote them down. Two witnesses, two, one an apostle and the other a priest. Real witnesses who were on hand to record the apocalypse of Yahshua, Mashiach, and the other, the war of the Jews. The only records we have of those times of incredible prophetic fulfillment. I hope that you see it by now. And by now, where have we heard of two witnesses? And what part could an obscure, lowly believer, a monk no less, play in the epic and immediate halt of the most inhumane entertainment of the Romans, the games in 404? An evil that ascended out of the smoke of Jerusalem, a byproduct of the beast and false prophet, the Colosseum. The rest of our time, I give you the history of Telemachus. Got it. Let somebody in. I hope they got in. The history of Telemachus, one such witness and martyr whose trust in Yeshua and acts in his name through the power of this set-apart spirit, is seldom celebrated today after 1,600 years have gone by. But why study the stories of witnesses and martyrs? Because such studies deliver important lessons for us, especially as would-be witnesses ourselves. Elohim, the sovereign of all creation and of all history, has given us the ability to learn and recall history, so we're better able to conduct our lives, our own stories, our own triumphs. Even the quiet, lowly, solitary person can tarry and learn and receive spiritual power after a time and become a catalyst to change the world for the better. The following is just such a story. You may have never heard of Telemachus. We can learn a lot from names, as you know. The name has the meaning of tele, which denotes from far off or at a distance. It also has a second meaning. Tele also speaks of the end or the purpose or the accomplishment. The Machus in Telemachus refers to battle or warfare. Altogether, the name means remote battle for a purpose, a practice that we've been encouraged to do by Messiah, his apostles, by means of the powerful prayer of those immersed in the Spirit, even praying in the Spirit, like the hero Nehemiah, who taught us prayer for and prayer against, as David Hoffman spoke of today. And this we must do in order to ameliorate the evil destroying our beautifully created world. This is what we are bound and have to ameliorate. We have to improve. We have to mollify our world. That's one of the purposes. We're here in one of the most ancient and earliest covenants between Elohim and man. Remote battle to make an end of something is what I see his name as meaning. Words have meaning. Names have meaning. Perhaps you parsed your own name to learn what it means, and hopefully you were pleasantly surprised. We don't know exactly where Telemachus was from. All we know is from the historian Theodoret. It's that he came from somewhere in the East. And he could actually be from nowhere, for he was a monk, that is, a solitary individual, dedicated to fighting spiritual battles against immorality and evil from afar, just as his name indicates. But he was not the cloistered kind of monk, not a product of a monastery or a sect, but he was what was called a girovag, a wandering monk. No home, constant travel, and he was going from east to west, Romeward. He had nothing. He relied on whatever charity could be found in each village he entered on the way. In the word girovag, giro means circle, and vag means wandering or traveling in a circle, from which we get the word vagabond. As such, his kind was considered the lowest caste in the world community of believers, the lowest, and his presence was usually disdained, even though the esteemed Apostle Paul was also girovag. So not much is known about Telemachus, just one incident in his life in which he attains his purpose, his victory, his triumph, when he wandered into the capital of the world, Rome, in 404 AD. Wandered in. Here's the background of this little known monk, how he brought an end to the imperial gladiatorial games individually, and how the story has been adopted over the centuries until it was used 40 years ago by an American president at an international event. The church historian Theodoret, the bishop of Kiras in Syria, first told the story in the 5th century in his volumes of ecclesiastical history. The historian was living and writing when the event happened. In short, he relates how a monk from the eastern part of the empire named Telemachus came to Rome and was caught up in a swelling crowd on their way to the Colosseum. He was captured by the crowd, entered through the gate, not knowing where he was. Now, I just need to make an announcement here, Paul. When you see people coming back in, click them in, please, okay? The short story from Theodoret is this. After gazing upon the combat from the amphitheater, he descended into the arena. He went down out of the crowd into where the games were actually being conducted. And he tried to separate the gladiators. These sanguinary or bloody spectators, possessed by the demon that delights in the effusion of blood, were irritated at the interruption of their cruel sports, and they stoned him who had occasioned the secession. Everything stopped. After being apprised of this circumstance, the admirable Emperor Honorius, from whom our friend Finney gets his last name, who served from 393 to 423, numbered him with the victorious martyrs and abolished these iniquitous spectacles. The gladiatorial games had been declared ended several times previously, but always without success. Christian emperors, including Constantine, Constantius, and his cousin, the pagan emperor Julian, had abolished the games, but it took a more powerful spirit than an emperor to make it stick. Even Emperor Theodosius I, who made Christianity the official religion of Rome back in the 4th century, published an edict against these games. But it wasn't until Emperor Honorius recognized Telemachus' martyrdom that the games ended. This time it stuck because 6 years later, the Visigoths, under Alaric, formerly of the Roman legions, sacked Rome, a significant event in the decline of the Roman Empire. And though Theodoret wrote this very plain story more than a millennium and a half ago, it has been famously recounted several times for different purposes, including our own generation. Now, what would happen if the president all of a sudden stopped football? What would happen? It wouldn't happen. Or stop some other sport that caused injury, like high school football. What would the uproar be like? I don't think there would be one neighborhood that would keep quiet. Over 1,000 years after the martyrdom of Telemachus, John Foxe, Foxe, included him in his well-known Fox's Book of Martyrs. Some of you have read through it. Certainly, a lot of believers have. The contextual time of this book is significant because Fox was a contemporary of Queen Mary Tudor, who's also known as Bloody Mary. She earned this name for killing 300 Protestants as she assumed the English crown after her very Protestant half-brother, King Edward VI. His book recounts the martyrdom of many in the West. That's Fox's Book of Martyrs. But he's emphasizing the 14th through 16th century, ending with Mary. In 1563, he gives us more details of the story to say that Telemachus came to Rome's churches to spend Christmas and was stirred by the thousands who flocked to see the gladiatorial games. Despite his failure to convince them of their cruelty and wickedness, his death evidently turned the hearts of the people, says Fox, and opened their eyes to the brutality of their conduct and the hideous aspects of their favorite vice. But you and I know what mind-changing spirit affected these 50 to 80,000 people watching the bloodbath. They were used to murder, as we are from television. The act of martyrdom of Telemachus wouldn't have changed a thing unless he was the catalyst of Elohim's spirit moving among them. And we know that he was because he was a monk that was active in more than abusing children and women. For as he fell dead in the Colosseum, no further gladiatorial games were ever held there or anyplace else. It was the spirit through the act of Telemachus that turned the hearts of the people. Alfred Lord Tennyson, a poet laureate of Great Britain during Queen Victoria's reign, that's in the 19th century, gives us greater detail of this saint. He said that the monk felt called by Elohim to give his seclusion, to leave his seclusion and seek out the fire to the west, the Christian city of Rome. Borne along by a crowd of men, he was drawn into the Colosseum. He couldn't get out of the flow. Among the slaves, the dead animals, the dust, and the blood, he saw gladiators viewed by 80,000 spectators, he says. He moved down the stairs and into the arena, placing himself between the combatants. Forbear in the great name of him who died for men, Messiah Shus. As silence fell, it was replaced by the snake-like hiss of the audience. I can't imagine, without supernatural power, how one person in such a gigantic place could cause silence with his voice if it had not been the Spirit or a messenger, as Revelation says, with a loud voice, with a mega voice, did it through him. It was replaced by the deep roar of the breaking sea coming from the people and a shower of stones from the spectators who wanted him dead and achieved that goal. And then the season of silence. Tennyson says his dream became a deed that woke the world. Throughout the amphitheater ran a shudder of shame that came to the attention of Honorius, the emperor, who decreed, Rome no more should wallow in this old lust of paganism and make her festal hour dark with the blood of man who murdered man. In our own time, in 1984, American President Ronald Reagan told the story of the little monk at the annual National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, D.C. And at that time, he made a lot of history in doing so. This is not expected of a president. But his story, it's the narrative of a Hollywood epic, as it could only be orated by that Hollywood actor he once was, and a great one. President Reagan recounted the story in this way, and I quote, one moment, please. I wish I could imitate his voice. The power of prayer can be illustrated by the story that goes back to the 4th century. The monk followed a crowd into the Colosseum, and he saw the gladiators come forth, stand before the emperor, and say, "We who are about to die salute you." And he realized they were going to fight to the death for entertainment of the crowd. He cried out, "In the name of Christ, stop!" But his voice was lost in the tumult there in the great Colosseum. Then, as the games began, the crowd saw this scrawny little figure making his way out to the gladiators and saying over and over again, "In the name of Christos, stop!" And they thought it was part of the entertainment. They laughed. Many were amused. But then, when they realized it wasn't, they grew belligerent and angry. And as he was pleading with the gladiators, "In the name of Christos, stop!" one of them plunged his sword into his body. And as he fell to the sand of the arena in his death, his last words were, of course, "In the name of Christos, stop." Suddenly, a strange thing happened, recounted Reagan. The gladiators stood looking at this tiny form lying in the sand. A silence fell over the Colosseum, and then, someplace up in the upper tiers, an individual made his way to an exit and left, and others began to follow. And in the dead silence, 80,000 people left the Colosseum. That was the last battle to the death between gladiators in the Roman Colosseum. Never again did anyone kill, or did men kill each other for the entertainment of the crowd. One tiny voice that could hardly be heard above the tumult, "In the name of Christos, stop." It's something we could be saying to each other throughout the world today. Ronald Reagan, 1984. Notice how Reagan finished his story. It's something we could be saying to each other throughout the world today. Reagan stumbles into one of the great open secrets of our faith. Acts chapter 1, being endued and immersed in set-apart spirit. We could likewise be doing, confronting the powers of evil with these same words spoken, as in the days of Telemachus, and in perfect trust, in perfect confidence, in the name of Messiah Yeshua, you must now stop. Try that sometime. In the Walmart, when you hear a child screaming bloody murder, a demon has come into that child. There's no reason for that child to be so scared. Try it. You don't have to say it loud. In the name of Messiah Yeshua, you must now stop. Or Christ Jesus works as well. You must now stop. You're not speaking to the child, you're speaking to the demon. And you can do this from clear across the store. And you wait and see. Within 20 seconds, that demonstration will be done. I've done this many times. It has never failed, never. If it fails for you, maybe you need to take the next step. Imagine that if some folks have been able to tear down walls all by themselves through spiritual power, what could 1,000 people tear down? Or 10 tear down? Or just lonely one? What if we came to understand who we could be and what we could do in Messiah? What if we obtained a common vision and mission, being immersed in the power and knowing the risks offered us in Acts chapter 1? What could we tear down? Reagan tore down the walls, as you might remember. Remember what he said to the world from Berlin in 1987?
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.